Well, the polls are open and voting is underway in Virginia, where all eyes are on the high-stakes governor's race. Democrat Terry McAuliffe and Republican Glenn Youngkin made their final pitches to voters last night. First-time candidate Youngkin has recently surged in the polls, but former Governor McAuliffe is hoping to build off President Biden's momentum from the 2020 election, where the president won Virginia by 10 points. So Stephen Farnsworth is a professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Mary Washington and joins us now to break all of this down. Thanks for joining us. So listen, we've been keeping a close eye on what's happening in Virginia, partially because, many people feel that it could be a bellwether election. What's your take on it? Is this an election that may have echoes beyond Virginia, or do you think it's strictly local?
Well, I really do think that, particularly in this election, both campaigns have really tried to wage national campaigns using national issues. And so I do think that there's a great chance that win or lose today, some of the strategies employed in Virginia in 2021 will be employed in the midterms in 2022. This is the first $100 million governor's race in Virginia. And so it's clear both parties want to go into the midterms nationally with bragging rights of having prevailed in the Old Dominion.
So Virginia has been a reliable blue state in recent years. President Biden won the state by 10 points. It picked up a key House seat in the 2018 midterms. He's also had major Democratic stars like the Obamas and Stacey Abrams stumping for McAuliffe in the state. Why do you think that, it strikes me that if McAuliffe is just going to make this a referendum on former President Trump, that's not going to work in a state that, while blue, is really probably more purple. You've got to offer something else beyond tying the other guy to former President Trump. And for Youngkin, it's got to be, about other things beyond critical race theory, which isn't even taught in schools. Although if they win, they may say, well, that's all we needed. But I just sort of think that it's interesting that these two campaigns have become referendums on things that don't really matter all that much to the voters overall.
Well, I think that's an important point. It's clear that the Democrats really benefited in Virginia during the Donald Trump presidency. He was a very useful foil to run against. But polls have consistently shown that he doesn't have the same kind of ability to energize Democrats as an ex-president that he did as a president. And so the McAuliffe campaign, I think, has gotten the mileage that it was going to get out of focusing on Trump some time ago. And so the pivot, I think, could have been much more aggressively with respect to other issues, more local issues. Normally, Virginia elections involve significant conversations about economic activity, about bringing new businesses to the Commonwealth, about transportation, which is a major problem in some of the urban areas like those around Washington, D.C. and Richmond and Hampton Roads. Those are the kinds of issues that are often talked about. And that may be the way that McAuliffe could have done more to take advantage of the fact that he is a former governor. The Youngkin campaign, this is a first-time candidate, really was light on policy specifics from the start. And the idea of creating an emphasis on critical race theory, an issue, of course, that isn't part of the K-12 curriculum in Virginia, is going to energize the base. I think when you put it together, you're looking at two candidates really focusing on bringing out the base, the people mad about Trump and the people mad about, the changing demographic nature of the United States and what it means for traditional advantages that white males have had in our culture.
You would think, though, that part of Youngkin's strategy when it comes to sort of firing up the base would be to, haul out the former president, Donald Trump, which he has specifically not done. Donald Trump endorsed him several times, and there was this sort of virtual rally. They call it a virtual rally, but we hear from Ed O'Keefe it was more like a 6-minute phone call. Youngkin has really made a point of saying that he doesn't need to bring in heavy hitters, not just the former president, but other heavy hitters, Republican names, to campaign. How well has this worked for him? And do you see this as a strategy that Republicans may use moving forward in future elections?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that Glenn Youngkin has had to walk a difficult tightrope here. Trump was not popular in Virginia, and that created a very difficult environment if he were to try to embrace him too openly, too publicly, too aggressively. You have to figure out a way, if you're the Youngkin campaign, to sort of work the very difficult magic of keeping the Trump supporters convinced that you're one of them, but also reaching out to those suburban Republicans, people who might have voted for McCain, who might have voted for Romney, but not for Trump, to try to convince them that you're a different kind of Republican than the Trump movement suggests. I mean, this strategy has to be one of the more difficult strategies. And it's really, really important that you undertake such a strategy in Virginia, where Trump was not popular. If you're talking about running in the midterm elections in a more red state than Virginia, you may be able to embrace Trump more openly. But I think for a first-time candidate, win or lose, Glenn Youngkin has demonstrated an ability to pull off this very difficult strategy of keeping Republicans on side, even though Republicans themselves have very different ideas about the former president.
And so, Dr. Farnsworth, as you know, Youngkin held a rally last night in Loudoun County that drew thousands of supporters, a county that went Democratic by nearly 20 points in the last gubernatorial election. By contrast, the McAuliffe campaign also held a rally, was not as heavily attended as Youngkin's rally. You know, it strikes me that Democrats, and let's recall what happened when President Obama was elected, what happened in the midterms then. Are Democrats still struggling with keeping their voters motivated so that we don't, or they don't see, I should say, a repeat of what we saw back in the midterms after the 2008 election?
Yeah, I do think that this should be a concern among Democrats, particularly Democrats in Washington. If you look at the McAuliffe campaign, one of the things that they really pressed Washington Democrats to do was to make some deals on these big legislative packages that are still in front of Congress right now. McAuliffe made it very clear that he does not want to provide ammunition to the Republican claim that Democrats can't govern. And he asked Democrats in Congress to come to some agreement on some of these bills more rapidly than they did. And so I think that if McAuliffe does end up losing, part of the problem will be as a result of the failure of the Democrats in Congress to reach some kind of agreement that they could point to as an accomplishment. Because if you have a majority and you don't use it, it's going to be much harder to keep those people who expected real change in this election on board for getting to turn out and otherwise participate in the contests and events that go forward. I think that the difficulties of getting people to these rallies may be part of that frustration that more change has not come as a result for Democrats, at least with respect to the victories in 2020.
Okay, here's perhaps another argument. Already 1 million Virginians have already cast their ballots. Maybe the poor showing at McAuliffe's rally is because people have already made their decision and they don't feel it necessary to come out to these rallies. Do you think expanded early voting may work out in the favor of the Democrats?
Well, I think that was clearly the case in the previous 2020 election, that the early voting really favored the Democrats. But in 2021 in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin has been very aggressive about getting people to turn out early, to vote early. And he is not repeating Donald Trump's mistake of 2020 when he tried to discourage people from voting early. And so the rural early voting is way up as well as the urban and suburban early voting. I do wonder, though, I think you're right on this point about whether or not people are going to show up at rallies the same way that they used to, because so many more votes are cast early in Virginia this election cycle because of new laws making it easier to cast a ballot in Virginia. You are going to see people who have already voted, and so for them the election may be over. I'm not sure that you can convince people to show up at a rally when for them the ballot has already been cast and it's something that's also behind them. Another issue is important to note too, I think, is the Democrats might be a little more skittish with respect to public events given COVID concerns. There's always a higher level of denial among Republican supporters about health care risks relating to COVID. We've seen that across the 2 years. So I think there are a whole bunch of reasons why we shouldn't necessarily look at enthusiasm at crowd size as some sort of determinant of who's going to win an election.
All right, Professor Stephen Farnsworth, really great analysis. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too. We will have a lot more to come on Virginia's gubernatorial election throughout the day. And don't forget, tonight, Elaine Keano, Ed O'Keefe, and Major Garrett will be here for a special edition of Red and Blue. It all starts at 5 p.m. Eastern right here on CBSN.